We're live. Welcome, everyone, to a special live edition of To Save Us from Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I am your co host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm a journalist who's covered the United Nations for 20 years.
And I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University in New York. I teach and I research and I write about the United Nations.
And Anjali, we are holding this special live edition of To Save Us from Hell because what unfolded at the United Nations this week is something that to me is completely unprecedented. Like, I speak for a living and I am
Yeah.
having a hard time articulating, especially to like normies, like how the magnitude of what has unfolded at Turtle Bay over the last few days. It's wild.
Yeah, it's a pretty. I think you put it in the title of the episode. It's a seismic shift. That actually really very few things in international politics happen overnight, but this did happen overnight. It was presaged, obviously, by the election of Donald Trump, but still, to have a major world power switch sides in a war like this, unilaterally, quickly, immediately, is it's hard to find a historical precedent for that.
So why don't I run through like a TikTok rundown of events as they unfolded over these last few days to give listeners a sense of what we're talking about. So for many weeks now, there's been a General Assembly meeting scheduled to mark the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This was scheduled for Monday, the 24th. Now, for the several weeks leading up to this General Assembly meeting, the European Union and Ukraine had been circulating a draft resolution marking the anniversary that said all of like the things you would expect it to say. It condemned Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It affirmed Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, all kind of normal stuff. And the process for the EU and for Ukraine was to gather as many co-sponsors and as much support for this resolution ahead of the vote, so they can demonstrate profound international sovereignty in defense of Ukraine, profound international solidarity in defense of Ukraine's sovereignty.
As
So all, yeah,
Yeah.
all was going according to plan until this weekend, when surprisingly, out of nowhere, the United States introduced its own competing resolution on Ukraine that did not affirm Ukraine's sovereignty, that did not condemn Russia's aggression. In fact, this resolution is just like one paragraph, basically 3 sentences long. So I might as well read the whole thing for listeners. Mourning the tragic loss of life throughout the Russia Federation Ukraine conflict. Note that formulation of how they define the conflict. Reiterating that the principal purpose of the United Nations, as expressed in the Charter of the United Nations, is to maintain international peace and security and to peacefully settle disputes. Implores a swift end to the conflict and further urges a lasting peace between Ukraine and the Russia Federation. So this set up a showdown at the General Assembly between this terse and equivocating US resolution and the most strong and robust Europe led resolution.
Sorry.
Lost you for a second. You're back.
Yeah, back.
And
Yeah.
so what unfolded Monday was a series of votes at the General Assembly around these competing resolutions. First up, Europe put forward their resolution, which is like the strongly worded condemnatory one, and it passed. It passed at a vote of like 99. With 60 something abstentions. So, not as overwhelmingly as a similar vote of its kind passed in the wake of of Russia's invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, which passed like 141 to like 5. And then there was a series of votes on the American resolution because some countries put amendments, sought to inject amendments into that terse and equivocating American resolution. One of the countries seeking to add amendments to this was Russia, which seek to water it down even further. That vote was widely rejected. Then you had a couple of other amendments offered by Europe and Canada to make it a bit stronger. And so those amendments passed. And so the resulting American resolution was a bit more strongly worded than the United States had anticipated or wanted. So when the final text came to a vote, the US abstained from its own resolution.
That's right.
And then later in the day at the Security Council, a similar scene unfolded. I don't know if you want to explain what happened to the Security Council, but I'm at a loss for words here.
Why don't you keep going and explaining the dynamics of the two different resolutions at the Security Council as well?
Yeah, so very similar. So basically, the U.S. took that three-sentence resolution that they offered at the General Assembly and just made it a Security Council resolution. And then the Security Council voted on that resolution, and it ended up passing with 10 votes in favor, five abstentions, and no vetoes. So the narrowest of margins possible. And so what we've seen at the UN, therefore, is this full scale shift in American policy towards Russia against Ukraine. And it's not like it's subtle, it was done in recorded votes.
Yeah. And it's worth noting that, as you said, the first two anniversaries, or the after the invasion and then the first anniversary, um, with resounding support, these two resolutions condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine and affirming Ukraine's territorial integrity passed the General Assembly with active diplomatic work from the United States to get them passed, right? Like the US was a key engine. The US and its European allies were key engines in whipping support for Ukraine. Not that, the Ukrainian cause wasn't just or wasn't widely embraced anyway, right? There's been in the years since some discomfort, particularly among countries in the global south, about how much Ukraine has skewed the work of the United Nations. That's the perception, right? At the expense of other conflicts. But at the end of the day, the fundamental cause, right? The idea that Ukraine's territorial integrity is worth defending remains extremely popular. And we can see that from the first resolution after the invasion on through to this one today, which makes the US's position not just surprising because it flipped sides, but because it is globally isolated, right? The list of countries that have voted with Russia in the past, very small, very predictable, extremely close allies of Russia or client states of Russia that are dependent on Russia. And then the sort of addition of the US to that list really demonstrates what the US is as a result. It is a client of Russia's in this conflict, as opposed to a steadfast guarantor of Ukraine's ability to continue waging the war. That's before we get to the fact that what the US is also doing here is fundamentally transforming itself from an underwriter of the United Nations system, right? Which at its core, the UN is a pact that outlaws aggressive warfare and affirms the sovereign territorial integrity of every member state, right? The equality before the law and the inviolability of its physical territories are cardinal principles of United Nations membership. And so, by signing on to a resolution, not just signing on to, drafting, putting forth a resolution that essentially says that there is no clear Ukrainian cause for belligerence, that the war should end, right, without the sort of affirmation of Ukraine's sovereign territorial integrity, shows us that the US is not committed to the cardinal principles of the United Nations. And that means that the US is no longer the guarantor of this system, it is a risk generator for this system.
Mhm.
What it will do is try and pull down the principles that underpin this compact between states.
That is a really, really important articulation of the significance of this because I feel like most commentators that I've seen and most commentary I've seen has viewed this vote kind of exclusively through the lens of the Russia Ukraine conflict, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, however you want to formulate it. And that's like an important lens with which to view this, right? Like, this was the US switching sides in that conflict. But the point you just made is why I think UN watchers like you and I, why our jaws hit the floor. because this move goes far beyond the Ukraine conflict. It strikes to the core fundamental principle of the United Nations, the key element of the UN Charter, that a more powerful country can't just invade and take the territory and try to topple the government of a neighbor. And that you have the United States, which, as you said, has been the guarantor of this liberal international order, that is the one that's undermining this. Like you would expect Russia to undermine this, right? Because that's what they've been doing for so long. And so this to me just calls into question, frankly, like the viability of the United Nations going forward, at least in matters pertaining to peace and security. It'll do what it can do on humanitarian issues, but if the US can't abide by this fundamental principle of the UN Charter, then what else can prop up? What else can be a pillar of our international system?
Well, I think there are a couple of things happening here. The first is that, you know, the reason the U.S. has fundamentally been the key guarantor of the UN system from its inception onwards, right? 80 odd years afterwards, when you read the accounts of the UN's founding, the US is instrumental. It's the key state producing the particular arrangement that we see, right? The sort of sovereign equality of states has obviously old roots in international law, but the way it's reflected in the UN Charter comes from the Atlantic Charter, right? It comes from that sort of World War II era compact between the Allied states. And then sort of married to like a global conception of the sort of New Deal for human flourishing, right? So those two components together reflect a particularly American internationalist conception of the world. Um, the way the particular arrangement of the Security Council looks, the five permanent members and with a veto, right? The veto is the contribution of Joseph Stalin, right? The veto is the cost for entry for the Soviet Union. It is only if they get the veto that the Soviet Union will agree to sign on to the United Nations. And the key idea here, of course, is that you want the five great powers of the day to invest in this organization to keep it running if you want to guarantee an order that recognizes the sovereign equality of all states and binds them to a body of law. So at the end of the day, regardless of whether or not the Soviet Union and then Russia have adhered to the liberal principles of the order, they have adhered to the pact of sovereign states that sort of comes, sits down, meets, marks international peace and security. They continue to use the chamber to shape international peace and security as they will. But the US has traditionally been its sort of key opponent at the Security Council, right? The sort of veto counteracting the veto.
Yeah,
Um, and we've never seen an alignment of the Security Council in which the US will act alongside Russia, right? Now, I will say for a lot of other states, this sovereign order, this sort of international order as inscribed in the UN Charter, as it lives in this body of international organizations, is vital, right? There's been a lot written about the liberal international order and the hypocrisy of it since the first Trump term, right? But order is for the weak, it's not for the strong, right?
mhm,
Order as it lives in the UN Charter is necessary for smaller states, not necessarily just for smaller states, but states that aren't superpowers, right? A key defender of Ukraine's sovereignty after the initial invasion in 2022, Kenya, right?
yeah,
Uh, Notably got up, not a small state, but not a superpower state, right? And noted, right, that like for post colonial states, the adherence to the UN Charter is critical. It is
yeah,
exists. Without the charter to guarantee this, we fall down into a world of great power politics and neo imperialism.
yeah.
So there
I,
are a lot of states that will advocate for maintaining the UN Charter,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, I know I'm glad you brought up Kenya's example and referring to Martin Kamani, the former Kenyan ambassador to the UN, gave a very powerful speech on the eve of Russia's full-scale invasion, and in essence, sort of framing Russia's actions through an anti colonialist lens. And his speech was very impactful in garnering the support of the global South in defense of Ukraine's sovereignty, in defense of that core principle of the UN that countries ought not invade each other. And as a result, you saw during that very first General Assembly vote on condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It had passed like 141 to 5 against, like 30 abstentions. Now, however, you alluded to this earlier, but since then, Ukraine has kind of been bleeding support
Yeah.
among the global South. The global South saw the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine through rising food and fuel prices, which hurt their own economies tremendously. There was that kind of Ukraine fatigue that kind of set in that you described, that like every other issue in the world took a back seat to it. And so over the course of these years, you have seen declining support, and that like strongly worded European Union General Assembly resolution on Monday only passed, and I'm looking at it now, in favor 93, against 18, abstention 65. That's significantly less than the first go around.
It is,
Um,
sure, but
yeah.
if we total the abstentions and the negative votes, it would still have passed,
Oh, of
right?
course. Yeah, it's still,
You're
yes, it still has passed. But to me, at least, these votes are more than symbolic. At least in the context of the Ukraine conflict, these votes are a source for Ukraine of whatever remains of its international political clout, especially in the context of declining and eroding support from the United States. It can point to the fact that 99 countries in the world support the cause of Ukrainian sovereignty as an example of the fact that they are not alone, and they can use that in their negotiations with Putin or whatever. But the fact is that that support is eroding. So to me, this vote was so powerful for two reasons. One, a demonstration of Ukraine's eroding support. Two, just a fundamental shift in how we understand America's relationship to the United Nations and to the international world order that it propped up for so many years.
Yeah, I just want to go back to what I was saying earlier about why the U.S. interests have traditionally, why it has been in the U.S.'s interest to underwrite the UN, right? Like
Yeah.
from its to say that U.S. national goals have aligned with the liberal internationalist principles of the UN Charter in ways that are not accidental, right? In ways where the U.S. can exercise global influence and underwrite global order in ways that benefit the United States. But if we have in power an administration that does not see liberal principles or democratic principles or internationalist principles as being in its national interest, then the UN Charter is not going to align with its goals. It will have no reason to underwrite the UN Charter and to serve as the system guarantor. It will instead, if it sees a world of in which it would like to be insular, autarkic, white nationalist, autocratic, right? See a world in which aligning itself with Russia and exercising power primarily through the Security Council at the expense of every other part of the UN system and at the expense of the foundational principles of the UN. That will be a world that aligns with the US government's foreign policy goals, right? And so what we're seeing here is a system in which the underwriting power is untethering itself from a system it built in its own advantage.
So, like, what does that mean? Where do we go from here, Anjali?
Well, I mean, uh, it's deeply uncomfortable, right? Like it's we are living through a period of massive foreign policy change in a way that sort of parallels the speed running of the constitutional crisis that we're living through at the moment. We
Mm,
don't know which way it will end up. I will say, right, that like much like with the dismantling of the American federal government, the Trump administration does not really know what it's doing when it sets out to unpin the foundations of the UN system, right?
yeah.
The way American power operates and is amplified through the UN system are not replicable through bilateral policy or through the sheer use of force. And in that sense, they may not care, right? But there still exists a huge constituency of people in the United States who do care, from the Democratic opposition party through to civil society, through to, most of the pre-MAGA Republican Party who are in their orientation liberal internationalists, liberal institutionalists, right? And to the extent that they can demonstrate support for this system and can demonstrate support for Ukraine vitally, right? Then we see a push counter push that is rhetorically important, even if it practically doesn't do much.
Mm,
We talked about this right after Election Day. The president has great latitude in setting foreign policy. And so, at the domestic level, American citizens, we can, um, you know, grind things that are illegal to a slowing halt by pointing out that they're illegal, by bringing cases before court, by um, trying to push the different levers of power within the state that are available to citizens and elected representatives. In terms of foreign policy, really the only things that we have are voice and, action. So we can protest, we can call our representatives, we can try and illustrate the importance of this system to others, and we can try and persuade. But other than that, there are not a lot of concrete tools that the
mm,
average try and move foreign policy, because the Constitution gives to the president a lot of latitude.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I know you have to go teach a class right now.
I have to go teach
Um,
the United Nations.
yeah, you got to teach a class. Did you like tear up your syllabus after after Monday's votes?
No, I mean, nothing is ever done, right? Like, we live in a world where contestation matters a lot. So Donald Trump's government can get up and say, we no longer support Ukraine, but that doesn't mean that the instruments and the levers of power and politics don't keep running anyway.
Mm.
So we want to keep
All right.
learning about
We'll keep learning. Well, thank you, Anjali, for your. This was really great, and thank you, listeners, viewers out there, for joining this live stream in the wake of this truly unprecedented action at the United Nations over the last week. We hope you'll become a paid subscriber if you're not already one, so you can support this kind of work and our commentary and our reporting on the United Nations. Thank you so much, Anjali.
it. See you guys later.
Bye.
Bye.